Good afternoon, everybody. My name is A.V. Jetter. I'm one of the organizers. Also a creator, artist. I'm tabling by about 20, no, just joking. But no, I do have a table. I'm an artist. I am a CCA alum. Just a little bit about me. I'm new to comics, so I'm a comics newbie. And I've been tabling at Zine Fest since 2012. And I think I met Ajuan right about that same time. Maybe the Art of Living Black at Mills.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And then also at APE. So for those of you that may or may not know a little bit about Ajuan, she is a professor at Mills, also an illustrator, artist. She's working on the 1001 Black Men drawing series. And also has published, I think, 3 books.
Yeah.
So the latest is Before There Was Harlem.
That's right. Yeah.
An anthology of African-American literature in the 19th century. And is that out or is that coming out?
Yeah.
And
In fact, they shortened the name to Before Harlem.
So you can get it at Amazon?
Amazon.
Right.
Or University of Tennessee Press.
Yes.
Either one.
And so, just dive right into the questions. So just a little bit of background. I want to ask Ajuan to sort of introduce herself and kind of tell us a little bit about how she came to making comics, and a little bit about the 1001 Black Men Project, specifically why you chose 1001 and why you chose Black Men.
Okay. Well, I have only been doing comics since 2014. I've been doing art for as long as I've been doing almost anything, but it's really since 96. That's when I really started to try to take art more seriously. I started out as a painter, painting mostly in acrylic. My main subject has always been African-American men because masculinity has always been an important or interesting subject for me. And so even as middle schooler or high schooler, that's been my main line of artistic inquiry. And so when I was reading in Essence magazine, I think it was winter of 2010, maybe January, February, and looking through the Celebration of Men, it was one of the Men We Love issues. And if you're not familiar with Essence, it's a magazine for African-American women. I couldn't help but notice that the celebration of black men was celebration of very wealthy, attractive black men in expensive suits. And I thought, wow, so I want to create some African-American media, since I'm an African-American person, that really tries to kind of meet African-American men where they are and as they are. And I didn't want to project any meanings. And I thought, I am perfect for this task. I'm not looking for a husband for a variety of reasons, but mostly because I've been in the same relationship since '94. And I am, I really appreciate my dad and his multiple brothers. And so I thought, I'm going to really try to do an exercise in drawing black men without projecting any meanings onto their bodies or their expressions. And so I thought that to really immerse myself in the subject, it would take me probably about 3 years to really get into the subject. And so I thought I'll do about 1001 drawings, a drawing a day, and it'll take me a little less than 3 years. That was wrong. It's taken me, I'm up to 957 drawings, so I'm almost done. But it's taken me 6 years, and so I hope to finish before the end of this year. But I have learned an awful lot about myself. Well, what I do is I go out in the community and I draw the men I encounter there. Some people I draw from memory, and I've actually gotten pretty good at that. But I also I do some live drawing when I'm at events like this. And I also draw based on photographs. I'll ask people, can I take a picture of you? Especially if I go somewhere like New York, and I don't have the time, or don't always have my sketchbook on the subway. So, can I take your picture? Can
you talk a little bit more about that practice?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that practice of drawing every day or almost every day has changed what you choose to draw and your technique in drawing? How do you feel like, drawing so frequently has changed you as an artist? Because that's a lot of discipline, that's a lot of work. And I've seen your work evolve, and I'm just wondering what your thought process is on how it's shaped your creativity and your expression now that you're at 957. Wow, it's incredible.
That's a really good question. I have to say, I did a show of about probably 200 to 300 images from 1001 Black Men in the summer of 2015 at Soul Space in Oakland, and as I was putting them up, I was a little bit horrified and appalled because I thought I embarked upon the series with a fully evolved artistic style, and it had never occurred to me that drawing this way would change my style significantly, and it has. The drawings are a lot more complex. They are, I don't know. I guess I would say I was looking and thinking, was I a bad artist at that time when I started the series? More detailed. Because I'm drawing people who really exist, I have a greater sense of my own power and a sense of accountability. And so as I've gone along, I do less drawings from memory and more from live modeling or from photos because I feel really accountable to my subjects, especially since I'm looking at them and drawing them. But they're not speaking, there's no interview attached. And so that's how I understand my position as an artist has changed. But also I have to say, you draw that much and you really develop greater skill in those areas. And so it's been really interesting to see. Also, I use Photoshop to color my drawings. And I've gotten really good at Photoshop. So if there's a photo you want someone deleted from, let me know later.
So do you think that the practice has also sort of changed the way you look at Black men outside of art?
Yes.
And how so?
Well, for one thing, because I'm still working, I've almost finished all the drawings and I still have to add color and post them. And so, but when I was in the midst of still trying to find subjects, I have to say, I would look at African-American men and it's going to sound like a really sappy cliche kind of thing, but everyone kind of looked like a potential work of art to me. And it really changed, it broadened my sense of aesthetics, what is beautiful, what is powerful, and I felt close to my subject. I felt
because I remember when you did speak at Soul Space, you mentioned something about the majority of your drawings looked a lot like you and your fashion taste, right? And your aesthetic.
Yeah.
And then you made a conscious decision to incorporate more queer Black men, more non-traditionally handsome Black men, right? Older or shorter. You sort of started to branch out a little bit based on the not mainstream.
That's right.
And so how do you think that developed in terms of...
It's interesting because in some ways it's definitely, I changed how I see Black men because I had to change how I saw myself. Because I started out with a lot of hubris thinking, I'm going to go in and finally do the thing that Essence Magazine can't do. I'm going to draw Black men as they are, the full breadth of them. And then it took me probably about 300 drawings to realize that almost all the Black men were really kind of, if I was a man, what would I look like? A lot of people who wore glasses, a lot of kind of nerdy people, a lot of people who looked like my friends from grad school or like my dad and his brothers, a lot of men in suits. And there were whole demographics I was missing. I was not drawing homeless men. And there were African-American men who were homeless who I spoke to often because we always crossed paths at the grocery store. I wasn't drawing a lot of young men with the big shirts and baggy pants, even though I drive down High Street in Oakland and there are a lot of youth along that street.
Why do you think that is?
I think that it really helped me understand some of the patterns of bias, to be perfectly honest. People really gravitate towards the familiar. There are definitely some artists whose practice is the unfamiliar. I think about filmmakers like John Waters, who wrote a wonderful autobiography in which he talks about how he was drawn to the unusual. And wanting to make it familiar, but still celebrate its difference. But a lot of people, becoming conscious of how I saw black men and how I didn't. You know, who was invisible to me was a revelation, and I felt rather chastened once I realized that of all people, I was also leaving out gender non-conforming black men.
Wow.
I did have gay black men in my series, but all very masculine presenting.
Right.
And so it was around every 100 drawings now, I try to do an inventory and say, okay, who's missing?
Right.
Who do I need to learn how to see? And so 300, 500 is when I really started trying to step up my game in terms of gender non-conforming black men.
It's incredible that you're able to be analytical and self-aware in the moment, because sometimes it's hard to do that, to step back and take a look at what your audience may be seeing or what you're saying to your audience. You know, I kind of want to ask you a little bit about your background too, just in terms of education and who your parents are and where you came from, and what sort of informed your initial inquiry into even English or writing. Like, who inspired you? Who made you sort of become a professor, and who made you sort of, because I kind of see you as someone who searches and seeks and sort of investigative, right? Your art is very investigative to me, and so I kind of see that in your research that you've done for your writing, because it's all nonfiction, or primarily nonfiction writing. So who sort of sparked that interest in you? Is there a name or a person that you can think of?
Well, I think, you know, I think part of it is just being encouraged to be a very bookish person. I was a very nerdy kid, and my mother said, that means you're special and smart. And so continue to do that. And so, you know, I went to a lot of museums, I went to a lot of libraries, and just was very excited to learn new things and to explore. And growing up in the New York area is really a privileged place to grow up and fall in love with art. You know, I always say I kind of became a scholar at the American Museum of Natural History, and going there almost every weekend. At a certain point, I thought, if I see another brontosaurus skeleton, I'm done. If you've ever been to that museum, it's dinosaurs all up in the top floor. And so, you know, my dad was a scientist and also a teacher, and my grandmother and my great-grandmother, I come from a long line of teachers, and so knowing stuff is really prioritized in our family, and so it kind of was a natural fit for me to go ahead and go to college and then go to grad school. And I've always been interested in black people, in race, in how people are seen. When you grow up as kind of a nerdy black kid, one of the first things you notice is the difference between what people expect of you and what you are, and how people really react in an interesting way. And so the notion of how the construction of what blackness is and what representation does, I find it fascinating, and my scholarship is about that. Right. You know, how when black people write about themselves, what happens, what kinds of catharsis or transformation takes place. And so I think my art is also in dialogue with that. You know, if I'm gonna draw these folks, what am I gonna learn about myself, about people of African descent? And I really, once again, my audience, I feel very accountable to African American men in particular, because I'm drawing so many of them. And so it matters a lot to me how people feel seen or not seen, depending on how my work emerges. And the reaction of people of all ethnicities. I love coming to events like this and having and seeing, you know, what does it make people want to ask me, and what does it make people want to say, and
And so talk a little bit about your comic series. I think you're on 3, and it's sort of
That's
autobiographical, right?
Yeah.
What's the latest title?
Oh, it's Child's Play.
Child's Play. And so I've heard you read at Thinking Captions, and talk a little bit about what sort of, because I'm new at comics too, and so what kind of information do you want to impart to your readers visually? Because I'm always interested in words and plots versus visuals, because when I started my comic, I had no idea that I needed to write anything, and then I'm like, oh, I need a story with it. And I think your work, your 1,000 Black Men, sort of is similar in that it speaks so strongly on its own, and reading your comics, the visuals tell a story and your words enhance that. But speak a little bit about the interplay, the interaction between what you're writing, and because the words are very strong and the stories are very strong and very personal, right?
Yeah.
And my work is not personal at all. So I'm interested in how you came to the point of, I'm going to tell a little bit about myself and marry these images with your personal story.
Yeah. That's a good question. My comic series is called Gender Studies. I'm hoping to do 6 eventually, and they're all about kind of what funny things happen in the world if you are a woman of African descent who is, as many would say, masculine presenting. And so many names for masculine presenting black women and people. And so, it's a kind of an odd thing because I don't keep a journal. I just bore myself immediately when I start writing a journal. Never lasts more than 3 days, and I think, this morning I had breakfast, then I went to work. It's not very interesting to me. But for some reason, it's only in the comic medium that I've actually wanted to write about myself. And it's been really fun because, and it's one of those things that I started, I was encouraged by cool people I met at Zine Fest to say, hey, to do comics. They said, oh, it's so hard, I can't come up with a story. And they said, you just think of an anecdote and draw pictures of it instead of just describing it. And then the words speak for themselves. I'm like, oh, I could do that. And the first thing that happened was telling a story about some of the funny things that happened when I was dating men in college, back in the 80s. The 80s was a funny time anyway. And so I really enjoyed that process. And it was an odd thing because I really am not a very confessional type of person. But through the medium of comics and being kind of funny about it, it was fun to kind of look back on some of these experiences I've had. The next one was about hair and when I stopped wearing straight hair. And for me, it was really a lot of things. It was very convenient because I was a rugby player and it's easier to have short hair if you're playing sports. And also because it felt better for me from a gender perspective. 30 years ago this weekend, I stopped straightening my hair. Wow. And so telling a story about that. And most recently, my story is about my oldest niece, who is now 8.5, but when she was about 3 or 4, all of a sudden she became obsessed with who the boys were and who the girls were, and how could you tell? So she was ask everybody and ask me, and then she didn't believe me, so she asked my partner. Juan says she's a girl. Is that true? And so all of these funny ways that gender plays itself out in my life. I think my next one might be about nerd being a gender also. And, is nerd a gender? Maybe. And so it's been really interesting. It's really been wonderful too, because I realize that looking back on my life and looking back on things that some people experience as marginalizing, like gender and gender nonconformity, for me, actually, I remember a lot of it with humor. And so that makes me think, I've had a lot of privileged ability to kind of enjoy the ride and find humor in some of the contradictions. So.
I really enjoyed the zine, the bear zine. Can you talk a little bit about, are you going to write more of those or?
Oh yeah.
The Black Bear
Yeah.
series.
I have a zine called The Little Book of Big Black Bears, and zines have brought out the nursery rhyme in me. So I teach in an English department that has a lot of people who are really good poets and novelists, and so my reaction has been to write rhyming couplets. To be clear, I'm not trying to be good at this. I'm just trying to rhyme. And so I was participating in a Zine Fest for LGBTQ themes as well as erotic themes across genders, and I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll write about black bears, because black gay men in the bear community they're not nearly as visible as other bears, and I draw black men anyway. And so I first drew a whole bunch of bear drawings, and I drew real bear humans, and then I did human bear hybrids, and I put them all together. And then I think this is in its probably 4th version, because it was probably in the 2nd version that I thought, I'm going to write a rhyme about bears and give each page a line of the poem. And so I wrote 2 poems about bears. One is kind of a nursery rhyme called The Black Teddy Bear's Picnic, and then one is just kind of a description. It walks you through about probably 14 different bears with one line about each of them. And it's just, I think there are a lot of gender and race stories to tell, especially about black men and black bodies and black male sexuality. And so my bid is to really kind of be celebratory and I'm kind of a silly person, and so write something fun and silly, and joyful. Yeah.
And I was gonna say the humor in it is great, and then the exposure is awesome too, because like you said, you don't hear about gay black bears, and it's incredibly funny, and it's wonderful. Yeah, I laughed for a good look. Wow, that's a good one. I also had questions too. You're part of the Black Woman is God exhibit,
Yeah.
and can you talk a little bit about that exhibit
yeah.
and what that's about?
Well, I have to give props to Karen Sinafero, who kind of developed this idea of the Black Woman is God. We just had an exhibit. It's the name of a series of exhibits of Black women artists, mostly from the Bay Area, although it's gotten bigger. This is our third incarnation that we did at SOMARTS, and there were over 50 Black women artists in this space. And it was kind of intense to just walk in and see the walls literally filled with art by women of African descent depicting Black women. And different people interpreted the Black woman the Black woman is God in different ways. For me, it was kind of a time to. I did 3 pieces in which I celebrate some of our forebears, and they're at my table, so I can show you some of what I drew for that. But it was a wonderful celebration, and one of the things that I thought was really intense was at the opening there were somewhere between 12 and 1,500 people at the opening.
Wow.
And it just gave me a feeling that there's a need. People want to see how Black women see themselves. And to draw that many people to an event that isn't necessarily that easy to get to was just powerful. And I know people who went to see the exhibit 2 times, 3 times, just to kind of be in this space and absorb it. It was wonderful.
Take it all in.
As someone who really kind of identifies with a non-conforming gender, the challenge of doing something that really emphasizes Black womanliness and Black godliness and the goddess in Black women is always an interesting challenge. But I loved I thought of Black women who have died, and who would hang out with whom if they were alive today, and what would they be doing. So, I have Bessie Smith and Nina Simone having drinks at the Cafe Carlisle, or Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman sitting on a dock, put their toes in the water near the lake where Harriet Tubman retired, things like that. And that was a really interesting way for me to get into the whole notion of the power of African American women
Do you ever see sort of a connection between zines and exhibits like that where it's primarily Black? I know you talked about wanting to do a Zine Fest. Would it be something in that vein, or are you thinking just a Zine Fest, or are you thinking marrying the African American aesthetic with zines, or what are you thinking?
Wow, that's a hard question. There's so many. I mean, it's a hard question because I think when I think of say my dream Zine Fest, it would be really neat. I did the Brooklyn Zine Fest and the LA Zine Fest in the last couple of years, and there are a handful of Black zine makers at each of these events, and it would be really interesting to bring everybody together under the same roof.
Okay.
And then there would be people who do zines who don't even necessarily do these kinds of events, but maybe their stuff is at the Black bookstore or at a convenience store. Bringing all these folks together would be really cool. But then again, zines writ large are about voices that might not get heard in mainstream publications. Right. And so there's a lot that's really wonderful and challenging and transgressive for a multi-ethnic zine fest. But then, the idea that for a lot of people of African descent, I was on a panel about this at the Brooklyn Zine Fest. Some folks hear zine and they don't even think of what they're doing as that. They're self-publishing booklets and getting information out there, and it's a zine. But folks don't really see a space like a Zine Fest as one, because they think, it means I have to be part of an alternative art community. And so kind of trying to aggregate all of that to open up the zine world to people of African descent would be kind of cool. And so...
Yeah, that seems like a wonderful, that would be like amazing to me to see something like that? Because you're like you said, I do see people writing poetry, writing prose, and independently publishing it in chapbooks or making zines, and they're not aware that it's a zine. So that seems like that would be something amazing. And what do you see for yourself with your next? Do you see a next project after 1001 Black Men, or have you not thought beyond 1001? Or
I thought I will not do 1001 of anything else after this. I think I have learned I've done it, almost done it, not quite. And so the next thing will probably be much smaller, like 100 maybe. But I think about my discomforts around the series and the more drawings, plus everything that's happening in the U.S. and beyond about the notion of police violence against men of African descent. And I've become increasingly uncomfortable about drawing men of African descent without including their voices. And so the next project I'm going to do is actually going to include interviews. And so it's the tentative name of the project is Bay Area Heart and Soul, Black Portraits in a Time of Change. I think it will be men and women of African descent, some who've just moved to the Bay Area to work at Google, and some who have been in the Bay Area for 40 years and are seeing this change of which the prior type of person is a part, and get a sense, try to collect about 100 voices of Black people around how the Bay Area is transforming, and include, an interview on the website. I'm going to do another website, put the portrait up, put some excerpts from the interview, but I also want to incorporate words in the actual drawing itself. So portraits, again, but really kind of featuring and putting really front-facing, as they say, the words of the subjects themselves, so that they really are speaking for themselves.
Would you ever consider doing a film or video interview along with the 2D format?
I've spoken with a filmmaker on whom I collaborated with a different project, and she seems to be interested in doing short interviews as well. So hopefully we will have images and we'll be able to connect the series with short videos. So it'll be a little bit more detailed. I like being able to go into my house, close the door, and just 20 drawings later. So collaborating with someone will be a little bit different, but I'm very excited about incorporating video into this. Yeah.
And you said that would be men and women?
Right, men and women, yeah.
And do you, obviously I know you do draw outside of the 1001. How do you think about drawing women now that you've done all the drawings of men? When you approach drawing women, has it changed, or are you thinking of it in a different way, or?
No.
Do you think that doing a series would change that as well? I think it would, but
it might. And it's probably good for me. I probably should do a series of African American women. It's easier for me to draw specific people. When I draw just for fun and just make someone up out of my head, it's usually a Black man. But I do love drawing Black women elders as well. And so I've definitely thought down the road doing a series of Black women elders in the Bay Area and beyond. But
not to put you on the psych couch or anything, but let's talk about this a little bit. So the comfort level maybe is not the same drawing women. Would you say that?
Perhaps. I think also one of the things, what I love about drawings are, I think what I enjoy drawing old women, and I enjoy drawing men, and I think there's a way that I have to kind of transform my style a little bit when I'm drawing younger women to capture a very different face shape and these types of things. Partly I'm just not as good at it because I haven't done it very much.
Do you think it's a little bit, because you spoke about the masculine energy, do you think it's a little bit, you're conscious of the feminine energy and not trying not to sexualize your subject when you're drawing women, or?
No, I honestly think if I was not as self-centered, that might be true, but I have to say, to be perfectly candid, I think as a kid, my whole life, and this is many people's story, I've always identified more with masculinity. It's felt more relatable to me. It seems to reflect a lot of who I am. Like my role models when I was a kid were, Albert Einstein and Paul Robeson, and I felt like I could really relate to them. And so femininity has really felt outside of my knowledge base and my, like I said, self-centeredness. I'm much more interested in things like masculinity. I mean,
but I'm wondering if you would be interested in drawing other masculine presenting women, because that would be included in the spectrum too.
Yeah.
But I sense a hesitation there, so that's interesting to me. And
I like drawing things that are a little, I have actually, when I draw women who are young, I tend to draw women masculine of center. And I started drawing things like, that's kind of fun. It's not a series. I wouldn't do that series at this time because I also want to kind of chart new territory, and I have to give props to Alicia Lim's 300 Butches series, which includes people of African descent and a load of masculine of center women. And so I feel like she really has done such amazing work in that area that to do that series.
Okay.
Although I will have masculine of center women in the Bay Area Heart and Soul.
And is there a time frame for that? When can we be?
Well, if I can finish 1,001 Black Men by the end of this year, by the end of 2016, then I'll be looking to start up Bay Area Heart and Soul in the spring.
Wow.
Hopefully get the first of those drawings out in the first couple months of 2017, because I love having a project that kind of travels with me and, to make a part of my life for a long period. So I want to, as soon as I'm done with 1,001 Black Men, I'm going to be sad. Right. And I'll need to start something new. So, yeah.
And do you also do anything in the sort of 3D realm as well? Because we've talked about your writing, but do you do anything other creative?
The closest I've come to any work in 3D is found object drawings. I did a series of 4 drawings called Afrobiotic, The Natural History of Good Black Hair, where I use 3D found objects to for the afro, and to make them really complicated, plastic figurines, dice, all of these types of things to give a really textured afro. I like zeroing in on those features that are kind of right on the body, Black heritage, but I also like zeroing in and focusing on those features about which people have traditionally been uncomfortable. And Black hair is one of those.
Because I purchased a few of the black line or the acrylic heads that you use for Soul Space, and so it made me think of the paper dolls that you have on the cover of your latest comic book.
Oh, right.
So I'm thinking, would you ever consider doing an installation with maybe human size, life size paper dolls or something with paper cutouts? Because I thought that was a really powerful installation on that wall.
Oh,
and so I was kind of interested if you ever thought about doing installation with paper cutouts or something along those lines, because you also included Afro pics in your paintings and that type of thing. And so I was curious about if you ever thought about doing installation work. And I know Karen Sinifu does installation work as well. And that would be, I think, if you had a whole room of paper cutouts and painted images on actual cutout life-size bodies, I would think that would be
really fun.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And so have you ever thought of doing that type of thing again? Or?
I would love to. I had never done an installation. I did an installation of about, maybe 50 different faces and one or two full body figures about a year ago. And it was really wonderful to draw and just to see a wall of faces that I had drawn. And so I would definitely do that again. It was really fun. And
This made me think of African masks and as well too. And some of the other paintings too made me think of African masks. Do you draw from any traditional African cultures when you're? Because I know the background. Sometimes you pull the kente cloth and do that in Photoshop. Do you pull from any other African traditions in your work?
I use a lot of Adinkra in my work. I really want to tread lightly when I use African imagery because I don't want to appropriate. I realize that many people I've encountered from sub-Saharan Africa also want to be very clear about the distinction between being of a particular African tribal identity and being African American. But I do particularly draw on some West African imagery because, certainly most of us here have West African ancestry, and so I feel more comfortable. And then you look at things like the Sankofa symbol, which enslaved Africans used in their burial practices back in the 18th century, and so I feel like, okay, that's a bridge. Right. That series of symbols, if you aren't familiar with them, it's a series of symbols that have different meanings that are woven into cloth in certain West African cultures, and so I do include definitely aspects of that system of symbols. Yeah, and say when I'm teaching, because this is something I've learned as a professor actually in my own research, is that when a lot of our understandings of how people are, what culture looks like, relationships between groups or institutions is based on a particular body of knowledge that doesn't really draw on particularly people of African descent or other marginalized groups. And so I have definitely seen that when Black people who aren't really famous, when their voices are incorporated in their perspectives, it completely changes how something looks. And my best example comes from my own writing and research. When I'm a tenured professor at Mills College, and it wasn't until after I got tenure, and I have a master's and a PhD, and I say that because I had to do all of that to actually then have access to the large number of free Black writers writing in New York in the 1820s and 30s. I mean, this is a place I grew up on Long Island. And I think if going into New York and doing all this stuff, if I had known that for 150 years before me, there was an active Black writing and arts community, it would have changed my feeling of belonging as a Black intellectual. But those stories and those people's voices were never heard because they were Black writers mostly doing scholarship and creative work for other Black people. The Black work for a Black audience. And so that's been my focus is, when you create something when marginalized people create work for a marginalized audience, the sensibility is going to be necessarily something that generally pushes back against mainstream ideas and is audacious and funny and irreverent in ways you wouldn't expect, that are really kind of awesome and amazing. So I'm kind of obsessed with that, and I hope that my work does that kind of thing as well. Yeah. Thanks. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of a good question.
Any more questions?
Well, you said you were kind of new to comics.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious with like an academic writerly background, but then also being an artist, like how do the words and the pictures, like do you feel like you draw and then you have to find words, or how do you do that?
I write the story for the comics. I write the story first, and then as I'm writing, if I think, when this particular thing happens, it needs to look like this. Sometimes that happens during the writing process, so I'll draw a little stick figure just to remind myself what this particular scene should look like. But I usually write the story first and try to think of it in frames, and then I go back and I illustrate the frames. It's hard writing, though. Mm-hmm. It really does take a long time, and I remember struggling over a couple of scenes from my comic about hair for a couple weeks and thinking, I will never get this written and done. Right. One Zine Fest passed, I still hadn't finished it, another passed, and then I finally finished it. It took me about 3 or 4 months, and the hard part was getting all of this experience I've had down to maybe what would be the equivalent of about 12 pages.
There's a lot of experience in Black hair care, like I said.
It is. I could have written 100 pages about it.
Yeah, so I'm curious too, though, because this is a battle that I fight. Is I will wake up at 3 a.m. and I'll have a panel in my mind, and if I don't write the words and image down, I will forget it. Do you ever have those moments where I want my character to do this, and it has to be like, and I need to say it, and then you have to write it down, right? Or do you ever have those moments?
Or it'll disappear.
It'll disappear,
and
right.
So I use the voice notes on my phone a lot.
Stuff. Yeah.
And if I'm often in the car, I'll have this idea, this is what this needs to look like. And I immediately have to dictate it into the phone.
Yes.
or else I will completely forget.
Yeah, even if
And-
it's just one panel, right?
Right.
I do that all the. I'm glad I'm not the only one.
No.
Like I just, if it just that little bit comes out, and that's amazing because that's a struggle that I have. Do you also feel like it's easier, like you said, you write the story all out?
Mhm.
Is it easier to sort of think about where you're going with the story first?
I usually actually know where I'm headed. You know, with the hair, when I knew it's going to be this particular day in 1986, this is how we have to end up. And then this is where we start. And then what do I need to put in or take out? It's the paring down. You know, once I have all these scenes, I realize, oh my goodness, I got 40 pages of scenes. I have to pull out enough of those to keep the story moving. But to also make it clear. You know, people won't have to make too many leaps, and it's interesting because I always find that I can tell the story in about a third of the number of scenes that I first imagined. And it's more compelling, keeps people hopefully turning pages, and you don't get lost. Sometimes the more panels you might have, people can really get lost in the detail that feels really salient to you, but for someone outside to understand what this means, they don't need as much of the content as you experience.
And I'm learning that. That's what I'm learning. Because I'm at 40-something pages, and I'm like, oh, I got to edit. You know?
Right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so you mentioned that book by John Waters, autobiographical.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously really into like different kind of people,
Right.
which is a really heartwarming book. I read it.
Oh, yeah.
But then you also mentioned that you found yourself like at first drawing people who were a little bit more mainstream. So I'm
Yeah.
curious about that. Like, did you always know that you were attracted to like lovable weirdos, or and then still draw normal people, or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, the problem is if you're a college professor and you draw people of African descent who are really familiar to you, it's going to be a really rarefied group of people. It's going to be nerdy people who went to PhD programs, and that is just not representative at all. And so it really helped me. I had to think through a lot of stuff about power, because in some ways, you know, also realizing that although you may feel, oh, I'm a scholar and we're kind of, people think we're weird, and there's also a lot of power in that. And I realized that as a person, and then I you know, maybe I've been teaching ethnic studies on the undergraduate level too long, but you start realizing that if you actually have if you have some many kinds of privilege, you know, I'm a professor, I have a lot of degrees, and then you have to do more work to see people who are outside of your experience. As unusual as it might be to be a black person who writes about 19th century African-American literature, and I think I'm so out there, I have a responsibility, I think, especially if I'm going to seek to depict black people. I actually have to do work to see people who are not in my world. And that was the biggest revelation for me. I thought, wow, as a queer identified black woman, I actually have to do work to see people who are not in my experience, in my world. What must it be like if you're in the center in so many other ways in which I am not? It gave me a sense of how invisibility happens from the folks who don't see stuff. And boy, I'm still trying to figure out what that's all about. I talk about it a lot when I get the opportunity, because I think it was like doing an experiment, actually. I thought I was just going to be really good at depicting people in a diverse way.
And you had a question as well? Yeah.
How about black and gender bear? Have you run into gender bear?
You know, I will say that I'm certainly, when I do my series of 1001 Black Men, I try to be very inclusive. I try to be inclusive and include trans men as well as cisgender black men. You know, all the bears I drew in the bear book, that's one of the reasons I love the bear book, because I made them all up. So, some of them could be trans bears. I actually don't encounter that many black bears. And so it was one of those things that I don't let myself do this in the series, But in the bear book, I let myself make everyone up out of thin air. So those are all pretend bears.
We have a wonderful black bear in the Eagle community in San Francisco named Chris. He's also a teacher. He's loving.
Maybe he'll have to be in Bay Area Heart and Soul.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
I learned a lot. I hope I didn't TMI you too much with in-depth questions. I really appreciate you guys coming and listening. Let's give everyone a big round of applause.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it is at the